That night, instead of going to sleep, the pilots were lying about on their bunks, smoking and chatting. Skotnoy, who had had a farewell ration of vodka at supper, began to sing. The plane's in a nosedive, the earth's rushing to meet her. Don't cry for me, love, forget me, my sweetest. In the end, Velikanov couldn't keep his mouth shut. He blurted out that they were to be stationed near Stalingrad. The moon rose over the forest. You could see its bright, restless light through the trees. 2 kilometres away, the village seemed silent and dark, as though covered in ashes. The pilots, sitting by the entrance to the bunker, gazed at the wonderful world of the earth. Viktorov looked at the faint shadows cast by the wings and tails of the planes out on the runway and joined in with Skotnoy. They'll drag out our bodies from the twisted metal. The hawks will escort us on our last flight of all. The pilots, lying in the bunks, carried on talking. It was too dark to see, but they all knew each other's voices. Demidov was always volunteering for missions. He'd have wasted away if he hadn't been able to fly. Remember that dogfight near Zev, where we were escorting the Petliakovs? 8 messers went straight for him, and he fought them off for 17 minutes. He used to sing when we were in the air. I remember those songs of his every day. He used to sing Vatinsky. Yeah, he was a cultured man, a Muscovite. He certainly wasn't the kind of fellow to leave you in the lurch. He always kept an eye on anyone who was behind. Oh, you hardly even knew him. Nonsense, you get to know your mate from the way he flies. I knew him all right. Skotnoy came to the end of another verse. Everyone fell silent, expecting him to start up again. Instead, he repeated a well-worn saying comparing the length of a fighter pilot's life to that of a child's shirt. The conversation turned to the Germans. It's the same with them. You can tell at once whether someone's a real pilot or whether he's just on the lookout for stragglers and greenhorns. Their patrols don't stick together like we do. Oh, I don't know about that. They really sink their teeth into you if you're damaged, otherwise they'd rather leave you alone. 1-on-1, I can always give them a good thrashing. Don't take offence, but I wouldn't award medals just for shooting down the Junkers. Well, why should I take offence? You can't take my medal away from me now. I wonder what our squadron leader's going to do with his cow and his chickens. Is he going to put them in a Douglas and take them with him? Oh, they've already had their throats cut. Now they're being cured. Right now I'd be too shy to take a girl out to a club. I've forgotten what it's like. Oh, Solomatin wouldn't be. Are you jealous, Linya? Yes, but not concerning the girl in question. Oh, I see, faithful unto the grave. Their talk turned again to the combat over Zev, their last before being sent to the rear. 7 of their fighters had encountered a large group of Junkers on a bombing raid with an escort of Messerschmitts. Each pilot seemed to be blowing his own trumpet, but really they were talking about what they'd achieved together. I could hardly make them out against the forest, but it was another matter once they began to climb. Ju-87s. I could tell at once by their yellow noses and their trailing undercarriage. Well, I thought to myself, things are going to get hot. For a moment I thought we were being fired on by our own anti-aircraft guns. Oh, the sun certainly helped. I'll admit that. I dropped down on him with the sun right behind me. I was leading the left wing. And then my plane must have jumped a good 30 metres. I pulled back the stick. He was still listening. I opened fire on the Junkers. She was on fire, and then I saw a Messerschmitt banking towards me, like a long pike with a yellow head. But he was too late. I could see his blue tracer bullets. And I could see I was hitting the bullseye every time. Now, let's not get carried away. As a kid, I was always flying kites. My father used to thrash me for it, and when I was in the factory, I used to walk 7 kilometres to the flying club after work. I was dead beat, but I didn't miss a single lesson. Listen to me. He set me on fire, the oil tank, the feed pipes, even the fuselage itself. He even managed to smash the windshield and my goggles. There was glass everywhere, tears in my eyes. Well, I dived beneath him and tore off my goggles. Solomatin covered me. I was on fire, but I didn't have time to feel frightened. Somehow I managed to land. The plane was in flames. My boots got burnt, but I was all right. I could see my mate was almost down. I made 2 more turns. He He dipped his wings at me to tell me to leave. Then I was on my own. I just gave a hand to anyone who needed it. Oh, I was well and truly shot to pieces, as full of holes as an old grouse. I went for that messer 12 times. In the end, I singed him. I could see him shaking his head. I knew that was my chance. I shot him down with my cannon at 25 metres. They're not happy fighting in the horizontal. They're always more at home in the vertical. Now, that really is news. Why do you say that? Everyone knows that. Even the girls in the village. After a moment of silence, a voice said, "We'll be off at dawn, and Demidov will be left on his own. Well, my friends, you can do as you please, but I'm off to the village." A parting visit? Oh, let's go then. Everything. The river, the fields, the forest was so beautiful, so peaceful, that hatred, betrayal, and old age seemed impossible. Nothing could exist but love and happiness. The moon shone down through the grey mist that enveloped the earth. Few pilots spent the night in their bunkers. On the edge of the village you could glimpse white scarves and hear quiet laughter. Now and then a tree would shake, frightened by a bad dream. The water would mumble something and return to silence. The bitter hour of parting had come. One pilot would forget his gun in a couple of days. Another couple would be separated by death. Another would be allowed to meet again. The morning came. Motors roared. Their wind flattened the grass, and thousands of dewdrops trembled in the sun. And one by one the fighters took off, circled, waited for their comrades, and settled into formation. What had seemed so infinite during the night was now dissolving in the blue of the sky. Houses like little grey boxes, small rectangular gardens, slipped by under their wings. They could no longer see the overgrown path. They could no longer see Demidov's grave. They were off. The forest slid past under their wings. "Greetings, Vera," said Viktorov. The prisoners were woken by the orderlies at 5 in the morning. It was still pitch dark. The barrack huts were lit by the merciless light that is common to prisons, railway stations, and the waiting rooms of city hospitals. Thousands of men coughed and spat as they pulled on their padded trousers, wound their footcloths round their feet, and had a good scratch. Sometimes the men on the upper tier of bedboards gave the men getting dressed down below a kick on the head. The latter just quietly pushed their feet out of the way. There was something profoundly unnatural about the glaring electric light, the general bustle, and the thick tobacco smoke. Hundreds of square miles of taiga lay frozen in icy silence, but the camp was crowded with people, full of noise, movement, and light. Snow had fallen during the first half of the night. Drifts had blocked the doors of the huts and covered the track to the mines. Sirens began to howl in the mines. Somewhere in the taiga the wolves howled out an accompaniment. The dogs were barking on the main square. The guards were shouting at one another, and you could hear the tractors clearing the tracks outside. In the light of the searchlights, the dry snow seemed innocent and tender. Roll call began on the main square, to the accompaniment of incessant barking. The voices of the guards sounded hoarse and irritated. Then a swollen river of people flowed out towards the mines. The snow creaked under thousands of leather and felt boots. The watchtower stared after them with its single eye. Throughout the north, sirens continued to howl. The same orchestra struck up over Krasnoyarsk, over the autonomous Republic of Komi, over Sovietskaya Gavan, over the snows of Kolyma, the Chukotsk tundra, and the camps of Murmansk and northern Kazakhstan. To the accompaniment of the sirens or the blows of a crowbar against a metal rail, prisoners set off to mine the potassium of Solikamsk, the copper of Rida, the shores of Lake Balkhash, and the nickel and lead of Kolyma and the coal of Kuznetsk and Sakhalin. They set off to build a railway line along the shore of the Arctic Ocean, to clear roads through the tundra of Kolyma, to fell trees in the forests of Siberia, Murmansk, Archangels, and the northern Urals. Day began at the same hour of night, amid the same snow, in every one of the camps and subcamps of the vast network of Dalstroy. During the night, Abarchuk had a fit of despair. Not just the usual sullen despair of the camps, but something fierce and burning like malaria, something that made him scream out loud, fall off the bedboards, and beat his fists against his skull. In the morning, when the prisoners were reluctantly but hurriedly getting ready for work, Abarchuk's long-legged neighbour, New Molidmov, a gas foreman who had commanded a cavalry brigade during the Civil War, asked, "What were you tossing about like that for during the night? Did you dream of a woman?" "Don't you ever think of anything else?" "I thought you were crying in your sleep. I wanted to wake you up," said Monitza, another of Abarchuk's neighbours, who had once been on the presidium of the Communist Youth International. Another friend of Abarchuk's, Abrasha Rubin, a medical orderly, hadn't noticed anything. All he said, as they went outside into the dark and frost, was, "Guess what? I dreamt Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin had come to visit us at the Institute of Red Professors. He was very bright and lively. Jenschmann's theory created a tremendous stir." Abarchuk worked in the tool store, while his assistant, Bakhatov, a man who had once knifed a family of 6 during a robbery, was lighting the stove and stoking it with leftover cedar logs. Abarchuk went through the tools in the drawers. The biting sharpness of the files and chisels, impregnated with the icy cold, seemed to embody the way he had felt during the night. This day was exactly the same as every day that had gone before. The accountant had sent Abarchuk the request from the distant subcamps, already approved by the technical department. Now he had to get out the right tools and materials, pack them into boxes, and draw up the accompanying documents. Some of the packages were incomplete. This necessitated drawing up of special documents. Bakhatov, as always, did nothing. It was impossible to make him do anything. From the moment he arrived at the store, he concerned himself only with matters of nutrition. Today he was boiling a small pot of cabbage and potato soup. A professor of Latin from the Kharkov Pharmaceutical Institute, now a messenger in the first section, rushed in for a moment to see him. With trembling red fingers, he poured some dirty grains of millet onto the table. Bakhatov was evidently blackmailing him. That afternoon, Abarchuk was called to the accounts department. Apparently his figures didn't tally. The deputy director shouted at him and threatened to report him to the director. Abarchuk felt sick. It was impossible for him to cope with the work by himself, and he didn't dare complain about Bakhatov. He was tired, afraid of losing his job in the store, afraid of having to go out logging or being sent down the mines. His hair had already turned grey. He didn't have much strength left. Yes, that must be the reason for the despair he had felt during the night. His life had vanished beneath the ice of Siberia. When he came back from the accounts department, he found Bakhatov asleep. His head was pillowed by a pair of felt boots he must have been given by one of the criminals. Beside it stood the empty cooking pot. Some of the millet was sticking to his cheek. Abarchuk knew that Bakhatov sometimes stole tools from the store. He might, in fact, have bartered some of this for this very pair of felt boots. Once Abarchuk had found 3 planes missing and had confronted his assistant. "Stealing scarce metal during the war for the fatherland, you should be ashamed of yourself." "Shut your mouth," Bakhatov had retorted. "Or else." Abarchuk did not dare wake Bakhatov directly. Instead he coughed, banged the saws about, and dropped a hammer on the floor. Bakhatov woke up. He gave Abarchuk a look of cool displeasure. After a while he said very quietly, "Someone from yesterday's transport told me that there are worse camps than these ones here in the lakes. The prisoners wear fetters and have their heads shaved. Surnames aren't used at all. They just have numbers sewn on their chest and their knees, and an ace of diamonds on their back. Oh, nonsense, said Abarchuk. That's where you fascist politicals should be sent. Barkatov continued thoughtfully. You, first of all, you swine. So you can't wake me up. Forgive me, citizen Barkatov, for having disturbed your rest. Although he was very frightened of Barkatov, sometimes Abarchuk was unable to control his anger. At the end of the shift, Neumolimov came back in black with coal dust. Well, asked Abarchuk, how's the work going? Are people entering into the spirit of competition? Little by little. The coal's a military necessity. At least everyone understands that. Today the Culture and Education section received some posters. Let us help the motherland with our shock labour. Abarchuk sighed. You know what? Someone ought to write a treatise on despair in the camps. There's a despair that crushes you, another that attacks you suddenly, another that stifles you and won't let you breathe, and then there's a special kind that doesn't do any of these things but somehow tears you to pieces from within like a deep-sea creature brought suddenly up to the surface. Neumolimov smiled sadly. His rotten teeth were almost the same colour as the coal dust on his face. Barkatov came up to them. Abarchuk looked round and complained. You walk so quietly you make me jump. All of a sudden I find you right beside me. A man of few smiles, Barkatov said very seriously, You don't mind if I go to the food store? He left. During the night I remembered the son I had by my first wife, Abarchuk said to his friend. He's probably at the front now. He leant towards Neumolimov. I want the lad to grow up a good communist. I was thinking to myself that if I met him I'd say, Remember your father's fate doesn't matter. That's just a detail, but the cause of the party is something holy, something that conforms in the highest degree to the law of the epoch. Does he have your surname? No, answered Abarchuk. I was afraid he'd grow up to be a bourgeois. All through the previous evening and during the night he had thought of Lyudmila. He wanted to see her. He had been looking at pages torn from the Moscow papers, expecting all of a sudden to read Lieutenant Anatoly Abarchuk. He'd known then that his son had wanted to bear his father's surname. For the first time in his life he wanted someone to feel sorry for him. He imagined himself walking up to his son, gasping, hardly able to breathe, pointing to his throat and saying, I can't talk. Tolya would embrace him. Abarchuk would put his head on his son's chest and burst out crying bitterly and unashamedly. They would stand like that for a long time, his son a head taller. Tolya was probably thinking about him all the time. He would have searched out his old comrades and learned about the part his father had played in the battle for the revolution. Daddy, Daddy, he'd say, your hair's turned quite white. How thin and lined your neck looks. You've been struggling all these years. You've been carrying on a great struggle all on your own. For 3 days during the investigation, he had been given salty food without water. He had been beaten. He had realized that it wasn't simply a matter of wanting him to sign confessions of sabotage and espionage or to make accusations about other people. Most of all, they wanted him to doubt the justice of the cause to which he had devoted his life. During the investigation itself, he thought he must have fallen into the hands of a bunch of gangsters. He thought that if he could only obtain an interview with the head of the department, he'd be able to have his thug of an investigator arrested. But as time passed, he realized it wasn't just a matter of there being a few sadists around. He had learned that the laws that applied on convict trains and in the holds of convict ships, he had seen criminals gambling away other people's belongings at card games, even their lives. He had seen pitiable debauchery and betrayal. He had seen the criminal India, bloody, hysterical, impossibly cruel. He had seen terrible battles between the bitches who agreed to work and the orthodox thieves who refused to work. He'd repeated, "You don't get arrested for nothing," believing that only a tiny minority, himself among them, had been arrested by mistake. As for everyone else, they deserved their sentences. The sword of justice was chastising the enemies of the revolution. He had seen servility, treachery, submissiveness, cruelty, and he had referred to all this as the birthmarks of capitalism, believing that these marks were borne by people of the past, white officers, kulaks, bourgeois nationalists. His faith was so unshakable, his devotion to the party infinite. Just as he was about to leave, Neumolimov said, "Oh, I forgot to say, someone was asking about you." "Who?" "Someone from yesterday's transport. They were being assigned work. One of them asked about you." I said, "Yes, I do know him. I happen to have slept next to him for the last 3 years." He told me his surname, but it's gone clean out of my head. "What did he look like?" "Well, rather shabby, and he had a scar on his temple." "Oh!" cried Abarchuk. "You don't mean Magar?" "Yeah, that's right. But he's my very oldest comrade, my teacher, the man who introduced me into the party. What did he say? What did he ask about?" "Oh, just the usual question. The length of your sentence." "I said you'd asked for 5 years and been given 10. I said you were beginning to cough and that you'd be released early." But Abarchuk was no longer listening. "Magar, Magar," he repeated. "At one time he used to work in the Cheka. He was someone special, you know, very special. He'd give anything of his to a comrade. He'd take off his overcoat for you in the middle of winter, give you his last crust of bread, and he's intelligent, well-educated, and a true proletarian by birth, the son of a fisherman from Kerch." He glanced round and then bent towards Neumolimov. "Do you remember? We used to say that the communists in the camp should set up an organisation to help the party. Abrasha Rubin asked who should we choose as secretary. Well, he's the man." "Well, I'll vote for you," said Neumolimov. "I don't know him. Anyway, how are you going to find him? 10 lorries have left for the sub-camps by now. He was probably in one of them." "Oh, never mind. We'll find him. Magar. Well, well. And he asked after me." "Oh, I've almost forgot why I came here," said Neumolimov. "Give me a clean sheet of paper. My memory's going." "For a letter?" "No, for a statement to Marshal Budoni. I'm going to ask to be sent to the front." "Not a hope." "But Syomya remembers me." "They don't take politicals in the army. What you can do is help increase our output of coal. The soldiers will thank you for that." "But I want to join up." "Budoni won't be able to help you. I wrote to Stalin myself." "What do you mean? Budoni not be able to help? You must be joking. What do you grudge me the paper? I wouldn't ask, but I can't get any from the culture and education section. I've used up my quota." "All right, then. You can have 1 sheet," said Abarchuk. He had a small amount of paper that he didn't have to account for. In the culture and education section, paper was strictly rationed, and you had to account for each sheet. That evening, everything was the same as usual in the hut. The old guards officer, Tungusov, was recounting an endless romantic story, and the criminals listened attentively, scratching themselves and nodding their heads in approval. The characters in this confused and elaborate yarn included Lawrence of Arabia and various ballerinas he had known. And some of the incidents came from the life of the Three Musketeers and the voyage of Jules Verne's Nautilus. "Wait a minute," said one of the listeners. "How was she able to cross the Persian frontier? You said yesterday she'd been poisoned by the cops." Tungusov paused, glanced meekly at his critic, and announced brightly, "It was only on the surface that Nadia's situation appeared hopeless. Life returned to her thanks to the efforts of a Tibetan doctor who poured several drops of a precious decoction obtained from the blue herbs of the high mountains through her half-opened lips. By morning she was so far recovered that she was able to walk about her room without assistance. Her strength was returning." Ah, right then. Carry on, said his now satisfied listeners. In the corner known as the Kolkhoz sector, everyone was laughing loudly as they listened to Gazyuchenko reciting obscene ditties in a sing-song voice. He was an old buffoon whom the Germans had appointed headman of his village. A journalist from Moscow, a good-natured, shy, intelligent man with a hernia, was slowly chewing on a rusk of white bread from a food parcel he'd received from his wife the day before. His eyes were full of tears. The taste of the crunchy rusk evidently reminded him of his past life. Neumolimov was engaged in an argument with a member of a tank crew who had been sent to the camp for a particularly foul murder. The murderer was entertaining the listeners by making fun of the cavalry, while Neumolimov, pale with hatred, was shouting, "Don't you know what we did with our swords in 1920? Yeah, you stabbed stolen chickens. One KV tank could have routed the whole of your first cavalry army, and you can hardly compare the Civil War with the war for the fatherland." A young thief called Kolka Ugarov was pestering Abrasha Rubin, trying to persuade him to swap his boots for a pair of very worn slippers whose soles were coming off. Sensing trouble, Rubin yawned nervously and glanced round at his neighbours in the hope of finding support. "Listen, Yid," said Kolka, who looked like a wild, bright-eyed cat. "Listen, you swine, you're beginning to get on my nerves." And then he asked, "Why wouldn't you sign the form to release me from work?" "I don't have the right. You're in excellent health." "Are you going to sign?" "Kolya, my friend, I swear, I'd be only too glad to, but I can't." "Are you going to sign?" "Please understand, surely you realise that if I could—" "Very well then, that's that. Wait a moment. Please understand." "I do understand. Soon you will too." Stedling, a Russified Swede supposed to have been a spy, looked up for a moment from the picture he was drawing on a piece of cardboard from the Culture and Education section. He glanced at Kolka, then at Rubin, shook his head, and returned to his picture. The picture was entitled Mother Tiger. Stedling was not afraid of the criminals. For some reason, they left him alone. After Kolka had left, Stedling said to Rubin, "You're behaving like a madman, Abram Yefimovich." The Belarusian Konashevich was another man who wasn't afraid of the criminals. Before the war, he'd been an aircraft mechanic in the Far East, and he'd won the Pacific Fleet Middleweight Boxing Championship. The criminals respected Konashevich, but he never intervened on behalf of anyone they were maltreating. Abarchuk walked slowly down the narrow passageway between the two tiers of bedboards. His despair had returned. The far end of the long barrack hut was thick with tobacco smoke. Abarchuk always imagined that when he reached that distant horizon, he'd see something new, but everything was always exactly the same. The hallway where the prisoners washed their footcloths in wooden troughs, the mops leaning against the wall, the painted buckets, the bedboards themselves, the mattresses stuffed with shavings that leaked out of the sacking, the even hum of conversation, and the drab, haggard faces of the zeks. Most of the zeks were sitting down, waiting for lights out, and talking about soup, women, the dishonesty of the bread cutter, the fate of their letters to Stalin, and petitions to the public prosecutor, the new norms for cutting and trucking away the coal. How cold it was today, how cold it would be tomorrow. Abarchuk walked slowly by, overhearing the scraps of conversation as he passed. It seemed as though one and the same conversation had been going on for many years between thousands of men in transport ships, trains and camps, the young talking about women, and the old talking about food. It was somehow even worse when the old men talked greedily about women, and the young men talked about the delicious food in the free world outside. Abarchuk quickened his pace as he passed Gasyuchenko. The old man, who was married with children and grandchildren, was saying something truly awful. If only the lights would go out, so he could lie down, bury his head in his jacket, see nothing, hear nothing. Abarchuk looked at the door. Any minute now Magar would come in. He had persuaded Zarakov to put them side by side, and when it was dark the two of them would be able to talk together openly and sincerely, teacher and pupil, both of them members of the party. A feast was being held on the boards belonging to the masters of the hut, Zarkov, Bakatov, and Perekrest, the leader of the cold team. Perekrest's lackey, an economist called Zelyahov, had spread a towel over a bedside table and set out some bacon fat, herrings, and gingerbread. The tribute Perekrest had received from the members of his team. Abarchuk felt his heart flutter as he walked past. They might call out to him and ask him to join them. He could do with something tasty to eat. Barkatov was a real swine. He did just as he pleased in the storeroom. He pinched nails. He'd gone off with 3 planes, and Abarchuk had never said a word about it. He might at least call out, "Hey, you! Why did you come over here for a moment?" Abarchuk knew, and he despised himself for it, that it wasn't just a matter of wanting something to eat. He was aware of one of those vile, petty desires born of the camps, the desire to hobnob with the strong, to chat with someone whom thousands of people lived in awe of. Abarchuk cursed first himself, then Barkatov. They didn't call him, but they did call Neumolimov. The man who had once commanded a cavalry brigade, the holder of 2 orders of the red flag, smiled as he walked over towards them. And 20 years before, he had led cavalry regiments into battle to fight for a world commune. What could have made him talk to Neumolimov about Tolya, about everything he held most dear? But then he too had fought for communism. He too had sent reports to Stalin from his office on a building site in the Kuzbas, and he too had anxiously hoped that they would call his name as he walked past, looking down at the floor in pretended indifference. He walked over towards Monitsa's place. Monitsa looked up from the socks he was darning and said, "Guess what Perekrest said to me today? Remember, my friend, I can smash your skull in. And when I tell the guards, they'll thank me. You're the vilest of traitors." "There are worse things than that," said Abrasha Rubin, who was sitting nearby. "Yes," agreed Abarchuk. "Did you see how happy the commander of the cavalry brigade was when they called out his name?" "I suppose you were disappointed not to be called yourself," said Rubin. "Look who's talking," retorted Abarchuk, smarting at Rubin's perceptiveness. "Me? It's not for me to feel disappointed," Rubin murmured, his half-closed eyes making him look rather like a chicken. "I'm one of the very lowest caste, the untouchables. Did you hear my conversation with Kolka just now?" "You shouldn't say that kind of thing," said Abarchuk dismissively, and walked on down the narrow passage between the boards. Once again he heard snatches of the same never-ending conversation. "Borscht with pork every day, Sunday included. What breasts, you wouldn't believe it. I like things simple, kasha and mutton. Who needs all these sauces of yours?" He turned back and sat down by Monitsa. Rubin was saying, "I couldn't understand why he said, 'You'll become a composer.' It was a joke about informers. Do you see, writing an opera, writing to the operations officer." Monitsa carried on darning. "Oh, to hell with him," he said. "Informing's the very last thing you should do." "What do you mean?" demanded Abarchuk. "It's your duty as a communist." "Ex-communist," replied Monitsa. "Like you." "I'm not an ex-communist," said Abarchuk. "Nor are you." "Communism's got nothing to do with it," said Rubin. "I'm fed up with eating maize slop 3 times a day. I can't even bear to look at the muck. That's one reason for informing, but then I don't want to be attacked during the night and found in the latrine next morning like Orlov, my head sticking through the hole. Did you hear my conversation with Agurov just now?" "Head down, feet up," said Monitsa, started laughing, evidently because there was nothing to laugh about. There's more to life than the instinct of self-preservation, said Abarchuk, feeling a hysterical desire to hit Rubin. He jumped up and walked off down the hut. Of course, he too was fed up with cornmeal soup. How many days now had he been trying to guess what they'd have for dinner on the anniversary of the October Revolution? Vegetable ragout, sailor's macaroni, meat and potato pie? And a lot depended on the operations officer. The ways of attaining high position were obscure and mysterious. He might end up working in the laboratory. He'd wear a white smock. The woman in charge would be a civilian worker, and he would no longer be at the mercy of the criminals. Or he might join the planning section, or be put in charge of a mine. But all the same, Rubin was wrong. Rubin liked to degrade a man by ferreting out what was creeping up from his subconscious. Rubin was a saboteur. Abarchuk had always been uncompromising with opportunists. He had hated all double dealers and socially alien elements. His spiritual strength, his faith, had always lain in his right to make judgments. He had doubted his wife and had separated from her. He hadn't trusted her to bring up his son a steadfast fighter, and had denied him the right to bear his surname. He had damned anyone who wavered. He had despised all grumblers and weak-minded skeptics. He had brought to trial some engineers in the Kurzbas who had been pining for their families in Moscow. He had condemned 40 socially unreliable workers who had left the construction site for their villages. He had renounced his petty bourgeois father. It was sweet to be unshakable. In passing judgment on people, he had affirmed his own inner strength, his ideals, his purity. This was his consolation and his faith. He had never deviated from the directives of the party. He had willingly renounced party maximalism. For him, self-renunciation had been equivalent to self-affirmation. He had worn the same boots and the same soldier's tunic, whether he was at work, at meetings of the board of the People's Commissariat, or going for a walk along the quay at Yalta when he had been sent there to convalescence. He had wanted to become like Stalin. And in losing his right to pass judgment, he lost himself. Rubin had sensed that. Almost every day he had alluded to the weaknesses and cowardice, to all the petty desires that somehow stole into your soul in the camp. The previous day he had said, Barkatov supplies his young thugs with metal from the store, and our Robespierre doesn't say a word. As the song goes, even a chicken wants to stay alive. When Abarchuk was about to condemn someone, and then felt he could equally well be condemned himself, he began to hesitate, to lose himself, and to fall into despair. Abarchuk stopped by the place where old Prince Dolgoruki was talking to Stepanov, a young professor at the Economics Institute. Stepanov behaved very arrogantly, refusing to get up when the camp authorities came into the hut, and openly expressing anti-Soviet views. He was proud of the fact that, unlike the majority of the political prisoners, he was there for a reason. He had written an article entitled The State of Lenin and Stalin and distributed it to his students. He had been denounced by either the third or fourth person who had read it. Dolgoruki had returned to the Soviet Union from Sweden. Before that, he had lived for a long time in Paris and felt deeply homesick. He had been arrested a week after his return. In the camp he prayed, made friends with members of the different Christian sects, and wrote mystical poems. At this moment he was reading one of them to Stepanov. Abarchuk listened, leaning his shoulder against the post supporting the 2 tiers of boards. Dolgoruki's eyes were half closed and his chapped lips were trembling as he recited, I feel that I have chosen everything, the time and place, the day I came into the world. I chose the strength to suffer fire, to fling myself into the water, to be hurled into the stench of flesh, smeared and profaned with blood and pus, dabbed with these wads of filth, and fouled by the 10-horned beast. His belly's stealth and blasphemies have left my soul unstained. For I believe in justice from above, the imponderable source of best and worst, that hears burned Russia speak in flames, and burst free in these words: Great Lord of truth and love, you carve in plenitudes of fire the life which craves abundance, craves your absolute. Prune to fruition with your burning knife, the tree submits. Now make my soul your fruit. After he'd finished, he sat for a moment with his eyes half closed, his lips still moving. That's shit, said Stepanov. Pure decadence. Dolgoruki gave a dismissive wave of his pale, anemic hand. Look where all your Chernyshevskys and Hertzens have got us. Don't you remember what Chadeyev wrote in his third philosophical letter? Ah, I detest you and your mystical obscurantism as much as I detest the organisers of this camp, replied Stepanov in a schoolmasterly tone. Both they and you forget the third and most natural path for Russia, the path of democracy and freedom. Abarchuk had often argued with Stepanov, but just then he didn't feel like it. For once, he didn't want to brand Stepanov as an enemy, an internal émigré. He went to the corner where the Baptists were praying and began listening to their muttering. Suddenly the stentorian voice of hut foreman Zakharov rang out. Everyone stand up! They all jumped up. Someone in authority must have come into the hut. Abarchuk squinted round and saw Dolgoruski's long, pale face. Yes, he was a goner. He was standing there at attention, still muttering away. Probably he was still repeating the same poem. Stepanov was sitting. Like the anarchist he was, he refused to submit to the sensible regulations of the camp. A search! There's going to be a search, whispered the prisoners. But no search took place. The two young escort guards in their red and blue service caps just walked down between the bedboards, looking round at the prisoners. As they passed Stepanov, one of them said, Still sitting there, Professor? Afraid your arse will catch cold? Stepanov looked up. He had a wide, snub-nosed face, and answered by rote in a loud, parrot-like voice, Citizen guard, I request you to address me politely. I am a political prisoner. That night, there was an incident in the barrack hut. Rubin was murdered. The murderer had placed a large nail against his ear while he was asleep, and driven it into his brain with one blow. 5 people, Abarchuk among them, were summoned by the operations officer. What seemed to concern him was the provenance of the nail. This particular type of nail had only recently been delivered to the store. As yet there had been no request for it from the production sections. While they were washing, Barkatov came and stood next to Abarchuk at the wooden trough. Licking the drops of water off his lips, his face still wet, he turned to Abarchuk and said very quietly, Listen, swine, nothing's going to happen to me if you squeal, but you'll really catch it. Yes, I'll fix you, and in a way that'll make the whole camp shit themselves. He wiped himself dry, looked calmly into Abarchuk's eyes, saw what he was looking for, and shook Abarchuk by the hand. In the canteen, Abarchuk gave Neumolimov his bowl of cornmeal soup. His lips trembling, Neumolimov said, The swine! Ah, Brasha, he was a real man, and then pulled Abarchuk's bowl of soup towards him. Abarchuk got up from the table without a word. The crowd of people by the exit parted as Perekrest came in. He had to bend as he came through the doorway. Camp ceilings were not designed for men of his height. Today's my birthday, he said to Abarchuk. Come and join us. We got some vodka. It was terrible. Dozens of people must have heard last night's murder. must even have seen the man walking up to Rubin's place. It would have been easy for one of them to jump up and raise alarm. Together they could have dealt with the murder in no time. They could have saved their comrade, but no one had looked up, no one had called out. A man had been slaughtered like a lamb, and everyone had just lain there, pretending to be asleep, burying their heads in their jackets, trying not to cough, trying not to hear the dying man writhing in agony. How vile! What pathetic submissiveness! But then he too had been awake. He too had kept silent. He too had buried his head in his jacket. Yes, there was a reason for this submissiveness. It was born of experience, of an understanding of the laws of the camp. They could indeed have got up and stopped the murderer, but a man with a knife will always be stronger than a man without a knife. The strength of a group of prisoners is something ephemeral, but a knife is always a knife. Abarchuk thought about the coming interrogation. It was all very well for the operations officer to ask for statements. He didn't have to sleep in the hut at night. He didn't have to wash in the hallway, leaving himself open to a blow from behind. He didn't have to walk down mine shafts. He didn't have to go into the latrine where he might get jumped on and have a sack thrown over his head. Yes, he had seen someone walk up to Rubin. He had heard Rubin wheezing, thrashing his arms and legs around in his death agony. The operations officer, Captain Mishanin, called Abarchuk into his office and closed the door. "Sit down, prisoner." He put his usual initial questions the political prisoners always answered quickly and precisely. He then looked up with his tired eyes, and knowing very well that an experienced prisoner, afraid of the inevitable reprisals, would never say how the nail had come into the murderer's hands, stared at Abarchuk for a few seconds. Abarchuk looked back at him. He scrutinized the captain's young face, looking at his hair and his eyebrows, and thought to himself that he could only be 2 or 3 years older than his own son. The captain then asked the question which 3 prisoners had already refused to answer. Abarchuk didn't say anything. "Are you deaf or something?" Abarchuk remained silent. How he longed for the man to say to him, even if he weren't sincere, even if it were just a prescribed interrogation technique, "Listen, Comrade Abarchuk, you're a communist. Today you're in the camp, but tomorrow we'll be paying our membership dues together. I need your help as a comrade, as a fellow party member." But instead the captain said, "So you've gone to sleep, have you? I'll wake you up." But it wasn't necessary. In a hoarse voice, Abarchuk said, "Bakachov stole the nails from the storeroom. He also took 3 files. The murder was, in my opinion, committed by Nikolai Ugorov. I know that Bakachov gave him the nails and that he threatened Rubin several times. Yesterday he swore he'd kill him. Rubin had refused to put him on the sick list." He took the cigarette that was offered him. "I consider it my duty to the party to inform you of this, Comrade Operations Officer. Comrade Rubin was an old party member." Captain Mishanin lit Abarchuk's cigarette, then took up his pen and began to write. "You should know by now, prisoner," he said gently, "that you have no right to talk about party membership. You are also forbidden to address me as comrade. To you I am citizen director." "I apologize, citizen director," replied Abarchuk. "It will be several days before I finish the inquiry," said Mishanin. "Then everything will be set straight. After that, well, we can have you transferred to another camp." "It's all right, citizen director. I'm not afraid," said Abarchuk. He went back to the storeroom. He knew that Barkatov wouldn't ask him any direct questions. Instead, he'd watch him unrelentingly, squeezing out the truth from his movements, from his eyes, from the way he coughed. He was happy. He had won a victory over himself. He had won back the right to pass judgment. And when he thought about Rubin now, it was with regret that he had never had the chance to say what he had thought of him the other day. 3 days went by, and there was still no sign of Magar. Abarchuk asked about him at the mines administration, but none of the clerks he knew could find his name on their lists. That evening, just as Abarchuk had resigned himself to the fact that fate had kept them apart, a medical orderly called Trufilev came into the hut. Covered in snow and pulling splinters of ice from his eyelashes, he said to Abarchuk, "Listen, we have a Zek in the infirmary just now who wanted to see you. I'd better take you there straight away. Ask leave from the foreman, otherwise, you know what our Zeks are like. He might snuff it any moment, and it'll be no good talking to him when he's in his wooden jacket."